Welcome to Supporting the Overseers, the State of Committee Staff, and the Legislative Branch Support Agencies. My name is Liz Hempowicz. I'm the Director of Public Policy at the Project on Government Oversight. I'll be the moderator for today's panel. I will keep our panelists in line. Just kidding, they won't need it. We'll see. I know it's after lunch, so we're going to try and keep this lively, avoid the afternoon slump. I know everybody here is as energized about oversight as I am, so I don't think it'll be a difficult job. Just to introduce our panelists, we have Casey Burgat. He's the Governance Fellow at R Street Institute and formerly of CRS, which is relevant for our topic today. Kevin Kosar, the Vice President of Policy for R Street Institute. Phil Wallach, the Senior Government Fellow for R Street Institute. And Eileen Larence, Deputy Assistant Inspector General for Audits at Amtrak, who previously spent 37 years at GAO. So she is an expert on all things GAO, which is also relevant for our conversation today. So I think how we're going to do the panel is our panelists have prepared some remarks. After that, I have a few questions for them to get our discussion started. And then we're going to turn to you guys. This Oversight Summit is for you as oversight practitioners. So I hope you came prepared with questions. And let's kick this off.
All right, I will start. Of the three R Street fellas.
I'm sorry. There's one thing, I know, I'm sorry. I gotta keep myself in line. There was one thing I wanted to do before we got started, and that was to go through some of the acronyms. I'm sure we will be using a ton today. And then I will turn it over to Casey. So CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, GAO, the Government Accountability Office, CRS, the Congressional Research Service, and IG, or OIG, which is Inspectors General, or the Office of Inspectors General. And now, with that out of the way, to Casey.
Nice. Round two. All right, so I was tasked with talking about committee staffs in particular and talking about their role, their capabilities in performing the oversight function, or what they're supposed to do performing the oversight function in Congress. I don't think it will be a huge shock to anyone here that congressional committees, when it comes to staffing, are not particularly prepared for the role that they are supposed to be having and have promised with the new influx of a new party in Congress to take on the oversight role that they've promised to do. And I want to start out with a few caveats. So having spent the last year or so diving deep into congressional data on all fronts, particularly within committees, in talking with people that are experts on this and talking with people in and off the Hill, I just want to throw out a few caveats. The first is that all committees are not equal. I know that that sounds pretty simple, but that is true with their staffing resources. That's true with their authorizations and appropriations. It's definitely true with their jurisdictions, and it's definitely true with how well they are able to respond to the oversight requests that their committee member bosses put on them. Related to that, not all committee staff are created equal. We talk about them as this monolithic resource that if you're on committees, you are expertise, you are ones that have chosen to make a career out of your service in Congress, you're committed to the issue that you've served. That also varies from committee to committee and from staffer to staffer. So I'd like to throw those out. And I want to spend the rest of my remarks talking about a few problems that I see, or at least something to think about as we turn to a new Congress, talking about oversight and the need for it. The first is just talking about general numbers. And Congress in general is facing a staffing resource problem. The offices are not equipped to do the jobs of a $4 trillion, $5 trillion government with constituent service requests, policy creation, and that's true on committees too. And when you look at the general trends, you'll see that committee staff have stagnated since the early 2000s, which a sad thing is stagnation is usually looked as a positive with resource. They haven't cut it, is a positive. When you get back, that ignores the reality of the early 90s with the Contract for America, where they absolutely gutted committee staff. I'm talking from the early 90s to current present day numbers. House committee staffs are down 40%. Senate is down 7% because that was more of a House-driven contract, but still they have stagnated. The government and society has not gotten more simple in that time. Oversight has not gotten easier, so to have the same number of staff over that period doesn't say that your abilities have followed suit. So that's one. There are some positive signs with this. We are slowly clawing back. I think committees were given a $737,000 increase which is like, oh, that's pretty good, but that's about what the Congress spends on Post-it notes. So it's not a huge increase in staff. It will translate into people, but what does that mean when we're facing these deficits? The other one related to staff is that they simply can't keep them around long enough. In personal offices, this is more true, but when you get to committees, we say that they are more expertise. They're longer tenured, and that's true, they are. But still, the average tenure in committees is about 5 years. That's not a long time. This has a lot to do with the environment on Capitol Hill. It has a lot to do with what they're paid, especially relative to what they can make outside the chamber. So that's a serious concern when you talk to people about revamping committee staff, because in all honesty, members take credit for things that committee staff do. They take credit for it at the end of what all the work back and forth, and these are the people working behind closed doors, actually executing the prerogatives of the committee. Since they do turn over at a high clip, we're entering a new environment, and this is true at the member level, and this is true at the staff level too, both in personal offices and on committees, that new staff, if they leave so quickly, that means that they only know what they've experienced. And we're getting fewer and fewer people, in fact, not so many at all, that operated in a different world, operated in a different environment where oversight was a true prerogative, where it wasn't politicized, and it was something that Congress really valued, even sometimes on a bipartisan basis. I know it's crazy to think about. And I was just looking this morning that positions have changed too. As this environment has changed, we have seen a politicization of almost everything. That happens too with oversight. And you see this reflected in what committees actually hire to do. So before, it was a lot of counsels, it was a lot of clerks, it was a long-serving staff, and now we see a huge increase in communication staff. We see a huge increase in member-assigned staff assistants to satisfy member requests. And just looked this morning that in all of Congress, there's 41 investigators, someone with investigation-related things in their title. Now, this doesn't count counsel, which there are a lot of, but these are just investigations. And you see Democrats in particular promise a huge investigatory oversight method in the new Congress. There's 41 of them, only 16 of them are in the House, and only 2 of them are on House OGR. So I'm wondering, that either means that councils are taking an investigatory role, which I'm sure is partly true, or they're just not staffed up to do what they say they're going to do, and maybe they'll fix it later, but I'm skeptical. The final thing is outside Congress, and this is something that needs to happen intra-institutionally, across branches, and that's that if you ask any committee staff what is a huge burden on their job, they'll mention turnover, they'll mention young staff, they'll mention training, but always at the top of their list, they'll ask, or they'll mention that the amount of information requests that they have to make of agencies is just absolutely unbearable. It's no good for them, it's no good for the agency, which makes it so that if every request is urgent, because it matters to some member on that committee, that information request, otherwise it wouldn't be made, that means that the ones that they really need as a committee to move things forward are taken, they're ignored at first glance. And I've talked to staff that just say that their committee liaison on the agency side says, yeah, it's a rule of ours that we ignore 3 requests, and if you come back for a 4th time, then we'll start talking. And this is just a breakdown institutionally that's understandable on both sides, because agencies don't trust committees to do non-polarized, nonpartisan oversight, and committees don't want to be the ones that are constantly asking for information that ultimately won't be used in the end. So these are the problems that I see in Congress. I'm optimistic despite my tone here. I think that there are unbelievably capable, long-serving, expertise people committed to the cause, as we have a whole summit on it. I'm optimistic, and I think that we're slowly crawling our way out of this, but there's still a long way to go.
All righty. Well, my topic is the Congressional Research Service, which aids oversight in various ways. And as a preface, I should note that I worked at CRS from 2003 to 2014 as a nonpartisan analyst, taking requests from Republicans, Democrats, everybody. And I also served as an acting research manager there. I left to work at R Street, a think tank, but I remain a very big fan of CRS, and I've been an advocate for increasing its funding and for giving it more operational freedom. The reason I'm passionate about the agency and think so highly of it is because I just see it as an absolutely essential entity for a mass representative democracy. And the reason I say that is people who are elected to Congress arrive here in DC with a very difficult task, overseeing a $4.5 trillion executive branch with 170 plus agencies, tens of thousands of pages of law, and more than 180,000 pages of regulations, which are like mini laws. Who could be equipped to handle that situation? Nobody. Nobody is adequately trained, and no person could ever be learned enough to be able to grasp even the teeniest part of it particularly well, let alone the whole. So this is why elected officials need a core of nonpartisan experts who can help them understand what's going on. And that is what CRS does. Now, my comments today are based on a law review article I published some months ago titled The Atrophying of the Congressional Research Service's Role in Supporting Committee Oversight. It was a slightly depressing story to tell. And you can find a link to it at the top of my Twitter account, which is at Kevin R. Kosar, and I've got some paper copies here if anyone's interested. So let me first give a picture of what CRS is supposed to be doing with regard to oversight per the statute. Then I can describe the role that CRS presently plays and how we got here, and then I'll conclude with, believe it or not, a hopeful note. All right, CRS. It was established 100 years ago, but was reborn into its current incarnation in 1970. This was an era when Congress sought to claw back its Article 1 powers. They did this through a whole number of means. One mean was to take the Legislative Reference Service and to rechristen it the Congressional Research Service and give it more powers and more responsibility and a heck of a lot more staff. Staff more than doubled in a very short time after the act was passed. Over the course of 70, CRS staff just keeps going up, 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 up. And CRS was also empowered to hire senior specialists. These were people who were paid above the GS-15 level, who were to be preeminent experts in their field. And the point of this was Congress had tried to strengthen the committees to turn them into engines of policy and oversight. That was what legislative reform was very much about. And they realized the committees need help. So that's why they had CRS bulked up, so that CRS staff could perform this role with committees. They were supposed to work hand in glove with committees and to do lengthy, deep dive engagements. Now, from the 70s to the 1990s, this arrangement worked pretty well. CRS analysts aided numerous major oversight efforts, Watergate and the Whitewater investigations and other headline-grabbing activities. Other oversight activities were way less newsworthy, or shall I put, news-making. They were newsworthy, but not news-making. Congressional hearings and deep dives on government reorganization, budget process reform, intelligence agency oversight, that got some ink. Whistleblower protection, these sorts of things were ongoing, and CRS was regularly playing a role in these. CRS analysts at that time would help run hearings, help pick witnesses, compile and analyze information extracted from agencies. They didn't stay in their office in the Madison building. Rather, they were in one of the Hill offices, working out of their particular committee's office. That's the way it was. CRS memoranda and reports back then very often were published by committees as part of their final hearings or as standalone committee prints. Back then, it was pretty easy for a CRS specialist or analyst to spend extended periods of time with committees. I talked to some of the folks who served in the 1970s, and they said, yeah, committee would call you directly. You would basically fill out a form, hand it to your boss, and say, well, I got to go help this committee. That was that. You could disappear for months. And this was a wonderful win-win arrangement. Committees benefited from nonpartisan expertise, and CRS researchers got to apply their deep knowledge and training to study policy problems through extended engagements that would go on for months. Over time, unfortunately, CRS's role in deep dives oversight began to diminish. One factor accounting for this is declining CRS staff counts. The agency grew from around 360 employees in 1971 to just under 800 in 1985. By the time I arrived in 2003, it was down to barely 670, And while I was there, it declined further to around 600. Now, some of these staff, admittedly, were replaced through automation. For example, desktop PCs meant the agency no longer needed typists, for example. But Congress's appropriations just didn't keep up with the rising compensation costs at the agency. CRS, one of the ways it attracts talent and keeps talent is by paying people well. It's one of those rare positions in the government where you don't have to be a manager to go all the way up to GS 15, which is somewhere around $150,000 or so in salary. Now, additionally, for reasons never quite explained, CRS's capacity to do deep dive extended oversight, I think, was also negatively affected by the fact that the agency quit hiring senior specialists who are actually compensated at the GS 17 level. Really, really top researchers occupied those positions. Instead, the agency started using the senior specialist title when it hired managers. Managers who oversaw research but didn't actually engage directly with committees on sort of deep dive investigations. Overall, fewer CRS staff meant fewer individuals to lend to the Hill for extended oversight efforts. Meanwhile, CRS's workload kept growing and growing and growing. In fiscal year 2016, CRS fielded 62,000 requests from Congress. The House itself also changed. The House cut its committee staff in the 1990s, as Casey noted, and that had effects. That meant that more constituent requests, more informational requests, just basic getting the facts activities had to flow from the desks of congressional staffers onto CRS. The rise of electronic communications also meant skyrocketing inflows into Congress of constituent requests and demands. Those also, with not enough House capacity, not enough Senate capacity, began to wash over onto the desks of CRS analysts and reference experts. Committees themselves, having cut their staff a bit, also made the conscious decision to engage in fewer oversight exercises. The regular bipartisan oversight of agencies and their activities fell away. Once upon a time, Congress had a real steady calendar of how it did oversight. This is what was envisioned by the Reform Statute of 1970. They were supposed to be regularly overseeing agencies and that you could kind of almost set your watch to it. There's not much of that anymore. Oversight seems to be largely catch as catch can. Oversight activities also, unfortunately, became increasingly politicized, which put CRS in a very difficult position. On the one hand, the agency you would think would want to help Congress do these deep dives, but on the other hand, you don't want to get anywhere near these highly politicized things because you face the retribution possibly of one side or the other saying, well, you're working too much for the majority or the minority or whatever it might be. And of course, CRS, the only revenue it gets is appropriations. So you don't want to tick off somebody who might come after your appropriation. So over time, this environment led to, as best I can tell, CRS doing far, far fewer deep dive investigatory oversight with committees. And so we find ourselves in this peculiar spot long after the 1970 Reorganization Act, where statute on the one hand says basically that CRS is largely supposed to be aiding committees, but right now the vast majority of what CRS does is for individual members of Congress, and it's not necessarily oversight. So what's the good news after that tale of decline and woe? First is that, to be perfectly clear, CRS does continue to do a lot of oversight for Congress. It may not be going across the street and staying there for multiple months, but they're there. Committee staff regularly download CRS reports and legal opinions, request memoranda to help them out, call analysts over to advise them on questions to ask at hearing, and those sorts of things. CRS also tends to receive lots of research requests from most, if not all, congressional committees, all of which is good. They're still engaged. They're doing what they can. Second, the other piece of good news is that the FY 2019 appropriations bill provided $21 million more for CRS to spend on staff. Now, mind you, CRS's baseline budget was around, what, $110 million? So $21 million is a large bump. And so CRS is in fact hiring. If you go to their jobs page, you'll see a lot of jobs listed there. How many of those are new jobs is not entirely clear to me. I'm not sure what the ultimate FTE count is going to be as a result of this spending bump, but this is positive. Staff counts are going to go up a bit. Now, whether CRS will be able to do more deep dive oversight engagements with committees, that's really unclear to me. I would not expect it. I think it could happen, but I think first and foremost, it would have to be initiated by the agency itself. It would have to proactively reach out to committees of jurisdiction, develop trustworthy relationships with them, and make the offer of bringing people over to do the sort of work that it used to do much more frequently. It'll also take, honestly, committee chairs who take oversight seriously, who do not treat it as just an exercise in scoring points or as an afterthought. And we don't know who a lot of the committee chairs are going to be next time around. So in the next few months, one of the things I want to do is to take a look at that and see where the real opportunities are for better oversight and for a better chance for CRS to do what it can. With that, thank you. Bill?
Okay, well, thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to propose that we need yet another legislative support agency to help Congress fulfill its oversight function. So I'm going to talk about a Congressional Regulation Office. But to sort of give you a sense of where I'm coming from, I wanted to start out just sort of setting the scene with a little vignette from the regulatory world of 2018. So this past summer, the Trump administration proposed an auto fuel efficiency rule called Safer, Affordable, Fuel-Efficient Vehicles Rule. That's safe if you're playing along at home. So that rule proposes to lock in place average fuel economy standards as they are set in 2020 through 2026. It would cancel increases previously required by the Obama administration that were determined through a process that was called the midterm evaluation. So as with many things in Washington these days, you got sort of instant partisan reactions here. Justifying this decision was EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt back in the day. He said Obama's EPA cut the midterm evaluation process short with politically charged expediency, made assumptions about the standards that didn't comport with reality, and set the standards too high. He said that actually reducing some of the standards would improve realized fuel efficiency because it would focus on making new, generally more efficient cars that people want to buy more affordable, rather than creating a very high fleet-wide target that would cause manufacturers to put out overly expensive cars that people wouldn't buy. EPA has also now said that with the new rules in place, drivers will be safer because they won't be pushed into lighter weight vehicles that do worse in accidents. Environmentalists and other supporters of the Obama administration's standards were unsurprisingly very quick to condemn the decision. Said Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, as usual, the administration sides with big, powerful special interests over the interests of average American families who will pay the price for lower miles per gallon and dirtier air. Said California Governor Jerry Brown, the cynical and meretricious abuse of power will poison our air and jeopardize the health of all Americans. And you can find this same debate playing out among people who can credibly claim to be experts instead of just politicians. There's a number of really complicated technical questions involved in this fuel economy debate. So how to best model the likely effects of policy changes on consumer welfare, on ambient air quality, on global climate change, on traffic safety. There are also embedded a number of big, important, fundamentally political questions. And those cannot be resolved by technical analysis. So to me, that implies that this is the kind of policy issue, a live question that Congress ought to be involved in. We need our elected representatives to be working through those kinds of trade-offs. That's how we make legitimate decisions. Instead, Congress mostly ends up keeping out of these things. There are some bills introduced, partisan vehicles that offer condemnation but don't have any real prospect of moving. And frankly, that was mostly the case in the Obama years with completely Republican Congresses in place too. They didn't actually sort of wade into the realm of action all that often. Instead, we sort of let the industry and public interest advocacy groups slug it out in the courts under the auspices of a 40-year-old statute, the Clean Air Act in this case. These days, that's the American way. So how did we get to this point? Why is Congress so disconnected from regulatory policymaking, which is arguably as vast and important a sphere as government spending, estimated in the trillions of dollars of impact on the economy every year. So Congress is the architect of our regulatory state, but it's much better at drafting ambitious blueprints than it is at actually keeping an eye on how various regulatory edifices are faring, let alone properly maintaining them in light of new information. Over time, there's been a decline in small bore legislation, the kind that incrementally improves our regulatory framework. The authorization process, which is supposed to be the forcing mechanism for doing that kind of work, is largely dilapidated. A huge portion of our laws go on more or less as usual, even though they do not have up-to-date authorizations. This isn't a complete total picture of woe. There are some noble exceptions. Congress passed a chemical safety update in 2016 that was many years in the making. There were FDA and FCC reauthorizations in 2017. There's a few little things that do get through that don't show up in the news. But by and large, it's a pretty disheartening picture. There's obviously reasons it's convenient for Congress to play the spectator. So taking sides in these kinds of disputes, like the one over the fuel economy standards, will inevitably make somebody mad. So Congress's willingness to intervene is one issue, and I'm not going to pretend that's easily solved. There's also then the question of Congress's ability to intervene more or less competently, weighing credible if conflicting expert judgments, and properly understanding the complicated technological and economic factors involved. The question is, if Congress wants to, is it actually equipped to operate on a high level within the regulatory sphere? I contend that it's not really, and that it has it within its power to change that by building a new specialized body inside of itself. So, acknowledging its own weakness in this area, Congress ought to be building a Congressional Regulation Office. That isn't going to mean making Congress the equal of the bureaucracy in terms of expertise. Congress is by its nature a generalist legislature, and it's not going to have an infrastructure of specialized experts to match the executive branch. That would mean it was not a legislature anymore. But it can use help in knowing which questions to ask, which experts it ought to view as trustworthy, and which agency justifications may be self-serving. So what would a CRO look like? What would it do? CRO would operate first and foremost as a counterweight to OIRA. So for those of you who don't know, another acronym to throw out there, OIRA is the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. It's embedded within the Office of Management and Budget. And as such, it is a part of the Executive Office of the President. Should be understood as a presidential tool for influencing and controlling the bureaucracy. That's not to impugn the work they do. There are good reasons why it makes sense for the president to exercise control over the bureaucracy, and OIRA does valuable work. But at the same time, it's naive to think of OIRA as having a uniquely valid, unbiased perspective on controversial regulatory issues. Right now, Congress does not have its own dedicated capacity to be able to go toe-to-toe with OIRA. It ends up very dependent on it in many ways. Sometimes committee staff could be in a good position to detect suspicious moves, but they're spread thin as it is, as you've heard from my colleagues. A CRO would allow Congress to have its own benefit cost analyses and its own big picture perspective on the effect that regulations are having on particular sectors of the economy. There may be some people in the room who just don't like cost-benefit analysis, for all I know. There are There are plenty of such people around, but you should recognize that cost-benefit analysis is sort of the coin of the realm in the regulatory world. And if Congress is just without any, if it's sort of impoverished in its ability to speak to traffic in cost-benefit analyses, it ends up at a disadvantage. So cost-benefit analysis, even if you don't like it, isn't going anywhere, and Congress really ought to make itself competent to act as a judge of what the executive branch produces. So Kevin and I have written an article that proposes building a CRO that would be roughly comparable in size to the Congressional Budget Office. So that has an annual budget of about $45 million. That's 1% of legislative appropriations, which of course are themselves a very tiny sliver of federal spending. So to me, this would be a very modest investment that recognizes the importance of regulatory policy in American life and the need for Congress to be able to be a more effective actor in it. I have a hard time understanding how somebody would think of that expenditure as wasteful. I should also note that it would not be a replacement for the CRS. Obviously, the CRS does a great deal of work within the regulatory sphere, but as Kevin has told us, it's reactive, and what it reacts to is what members happen to be asking it about. Of course, people do develop longer-term expertise, but that's the main driver at CRS. The Congressional Regulation Office would be different. It would be doing independent cost-benefit analyses as rules are working their way through the notice and comment process. So it would actually be ready to give opinions before things go into effect, let Congress be able to intervene if they decide that's necessary. And they would be charged with doing issue-wide analyses. So really deep dives that transcend any one statute and allow them to give a big picture. So without a Congressional Regulation Office, Congress's big picture thinking is supplied to it almost exclusively by lobbyists who craft narratives of regulatory failure. Those are sometimes accurate, but always self-serving. Interest group-driven statutory overhauls will always be inherently suspicious, but CRO-driven reforms could be more trustworthy. And obviously, as we saw from the experience of the Office of Technology Assessment, which got killed off in the mid-90s, an office like the Congressional Regulation Office can only survive if it establishes a reputation as being a credible nonpartisan broker. If it's seen as just a cheerleader for one side or the other side will kill it off at the first opportunity. I have some other thoughts if anyone was curious about how this could fit in with RAINS Act. Feel free to ask about them in the question, but I think I've gone on long enough, so I'll stop there.
Okay, I guess I'm wrap up. I wanted to say good afternoon and also thank Pogo for the invitation to join you this afternoon. And as just a reminder, I'm going to give some personal observations about the Government Accountability Office, or GAO. And I've been asked to talk about some of the challenges we face in trying to provide support to the Congress. I should confess, though, early in my career, which has been long now, I was the representative woman on these panels. Now I'm the representative senior citizen. So that's been a stark reality for me. But I hope you interpret that to mean wisdom and experience and expertise. I'm going to talk about 5 challenges I think GAO has in supporting congressional staff and some of the things we've put in place to try to manage those challenges. And I would hope my congressional colleagues in the office can let me know if I left any out or give some perspectives about how well those mechanisms might be working. First is our ability to be timely. Second is our ability to align our work with the congressional needs and interests. Third is our ability to keep and maintain our independence and objectivity in a highly political environment. Fourth is trying to communicate more effectively. And fifth is having enough people and expertise to cover the complex nature of the issues that Congress is trying to deal with. So 37 years at GAO and now 3 with Amtrak IG. All those years, it's one of the biggest challenges is can we provide decision makers with the information they need in enough time, early enough in time to make those decisions. GAO is more of a deep dive research organization, and we're known as the Congressional Watchdog. So we will look at issues, and we will take, on the good side, 9 months, more likely at least about a year, to answer questions that congressional staff ask us. So just put that in perspective to House staff who maybe have, a shelf life of 2 years before they have to start looking at different issues. So we have always been challenged in trying to provide decision makers with information in the times that they need, and that's been getting worse instead of better, I think. Second is, aligning, and closely related is aligning the work that we do with congressional interests. Again, the short-term focus of the House, they're looking at issues, from day to day. Sometimes they have to respond to what's in the media that morning. We get congressional mandates to try to provide information and going to support a legislative agenda. They have they have hearings that they might have to generate in a month or two, and here we are doing these year-long research projects. So it's, trying to match the work that we do with the interests of the Hill and the time that they need them. And we'll be challenged with the new committee staff that will be coming on board here. And one of the things that we try to do is meet with them very early on and talk to them about GAO and let them know what we can do and what we can't do, and how they can best use us. Smart staffers on the Hill understand that and plan a little ahead, and they know what questions to ask GAO, and they look a little bit further out in terms of their oversight and legislative agendas and try to align their requests with the way in which we can deliver the answers for them. We also have a couple of signature reports that we do from year to year or every couple of years. One is our high-risk list. These are national level issues that GAO has decided over the almost 100 years now. It's looking at the federal government. These are the signature issues that we think Congress needs to deal with. And every 2 years we give them a report card on how well we think the government's responding to those issues. So that's something that they know that's coming out every 2 years. The other thing we've been doing now is really looking at duplication and wastefulness across the government, and we've been regularly reporting on that, to probably mixed success on the Hill in terms of their ability to act on that and take the budget cuts and make the adjustments that we're recommending. One of the other things that probably maybe is a little bit of a barrier is sometimes we have access issues. Look, it's not, agencies aren't really excited when we come in and say, we'd like to take a look at what you're doing. So I spent a lot of time looking at the Department of Justice and some of the intelligence issues, and we had pretty significant access issues in trying to get information from the agencies to be able to meet congressional needs. There's a long history of GAO and its ability to do work in the intelligence community. So sometimes access challenges also hinder us into being able to, or a challenge that we have to deal with to meet the congressional needs. Third, independence and objectivity. So we're almost 100 years old, so we've kind of seen it all. We've seen parties come and go in terms of power, and we've been able to weather those changes, and that's because we are relentless at trying to be independent and objective in terms of the work that we do. And that's not easy to do in a highly political environment where, and that's probably becoming more so in current environment. So we have we've put a number of things in place to try to deal with that. Back in the mid-90s, under the Contract with America, GAO was also cut from over 5,000 staff to 3,000. And in part because we were perceived to be politically biased. Before Newt Gingrich and the Republicans took control or gained power, there's a traditional there's long tradition of Democratic control, and we were doing work for the party in control, and it came back to bite us. And so I think part of the reasons why we were cut is because that the perception that we weren't independent. And so that was a wake-up call for GAO, and we've put a number of things in place now to try to help deal with that. Things such as we try very hard to get bipartisan requests so that we get both the minority and majority to sign the requests and ask us the same questions. We also make sure that we keep each other informed of the work that we're doing. We treat requests from chairs, committee chairs, equal with committee ranking members. We make sure that we share publicly our results after they're issued. So we do everything that we can so that there are no surprises, and that we are trying to give equal weight to both sides of the issues, or both sides of the House. We also meet very early on with the staff who send us requests. Sometimes we work with them in formulating those requests, because we have to be very careful that the questions that they ask us are neutral and objective as well, right? And not politically biased. So we start from day one to work with the staff. We try to educate them on the approach that we'll take and what we'll be able to deliver to them in terms of answering the question. We will call the shots as we see them, and we will publicly release the results. And we have to do that. And so we're constantly trying to brief the staff on what we're finding, so again, that there aren't any any surprises. Fourth, I wanted to talk a little bit about communicating effectively. So I don't know if you've ever looked at a GAO report, but there's still sort of long research papers on certain issues. And this has been, I think, a challenge for GAO and some of the accountability community. How do we communicate with busy decision makers in an era of internet research, in an era of tweets and Twitter and instant information? So we're still struggling with that, I think, but we've tried to put a number of things in place to help us along those lines. And also media, it's important for the media to pay attention to our results too, because guess what? That's another way to hold agencies accountable, right? Public accountability through the media. But these are 24-hour, instant days of instant issues for the media, and so how can we make our information digestible for them? So if you've looked at a GAO report, one of the things we do, the first page now is a highlights page, so we try to have a very digestible summary of what we're finding that's accessible for busy decision makers and for the media. We have a consistent structure in our reports, so if you go through and just read the headlines of the sections, you should be able to understand what we're saying in that report. You know where to go to look for conclusions, you know where to go look for recommendations. So you should be able to get access to the information that you need more quickly. We are also trying to move to much more of graphics presentation. Long boring narrative is out, so there's a lot of push to have more graphic presentations. The GAO has a very busy Office of Public Affairs, and they created positions in there to manage our social media presence. And so we're trying to have a much better presence there as well. And we issue press releases, so we're trying very hard. And it's my understanding, since I left the organization, we're also moving out on more of a web-based reporting pilot, so that you could have a digestible summary that you could click on and go to the facts and the details if you want it, if you're somebody that's more interested in the deep dive research. So my fifth point is, how do we take 3,000 people and provide the coverage and expertise needed to look at pretty much anything Congress requires or anything that Congress pays for? As you know, the issues are becoming more complex. Think about cybersecurity, and how does an organization like GAO have the expertise it needs to be able to address those issues? how does it compete in the marketplace for experts with those kinds of talents, and how does it pay for them under a GS pay scale? So we've been trying very hard to use our organizational structure to build some expertise in those areas. We have 13 teams based on things like natural resources, homeland security. We try to have our senior executives sort of grow up in issues and have some stability and expertise in those areas. And we can have access to outside help when we need it to help us address those areas. But we still have, some challenges to be able to provide the kinds of coverage across those kinds of issues. So with that, because we're almost 100 years old, I guess we've been somewhat successful in helping to meet the Congress's needs. We still, I think, are one of the top 3 to 5 agencies in the yearly annual survey about best places to work in the government. So that's helped us be able to be pretty competitive to hire new people and millennials into the organization. But, we're an accountability organization. We're very conservative. We can't afford to be wrong, so we have to have 0 defects. And with that comes a lot of process, a lot of checks and balances along the way. So balancing sort of who we are and where we've been with where we need to go to meet the needs of an evolving Congress and complex issues is a work in progress. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists. Unsurprisingly, each one of you touched on at least the issue of capacity facing Congress, but also these agencies there to help Congress. I understand the optics of members of Congress advocating to pay their staff more or to hire more staff is not great. I would say that it would be good policy to do so, but best policy and best practices don't always mean the easiest thing to do. So my first question is whether or not it's realistic to expect or to push Congress to invest in itself. It sounded like a lot of the ideas that you guys have brought up would require that on some level. And so I think before we kind of take on this issue of capacity, really we should be thinking about how realistic is it. And even if it's not that realistic, comparing that realisticness to the importance of making sure that Congress is properly staffed and given the resources it needs. So open that to the entire panel.
Yeah, I'll take that. I can't convince my mom that Congress needs more staff.
Wow.
And I try.
Who asked her?
Yeah, I just can't. And it's a tough case to make. Everyone thinks that they're just staffed to the hilt with young aides, and they are poor managers, which some of them turn out to be. They don't know how to use resources. They just think that there's this bloat in Congress, which is, I don't think, this is just me, I don't think that that's going to be a misperception that is overcome by reason. It is not one that you're going to persuade people to make. On the other side of that, the flip side of that is that I think that Congress can get away with increasing its own funds more than it thinks it can. We see these bills slowly increasing funds, and you don't hear about it from either side. It used to be a campaign issue that you can lose votes by spending more on yourself, but if it's for everyone, it's particularly at the nonpartisan sister agencies and even within committee staff, as long as you itemize who gets what resources somewhat fairly or at least acceptably, you can put these numbers in. People don't know enough. You can take advantage of their not paying attention. So it's a dark case to make, but that might be the simplest way rather than trying to make a persuasive argument that this is needed.
Especially if we're in an age of trillion-dollar
Right.
deficits, and it's a different environment than it was in 1995 or 2011. Right now, I think asking for a few $100 million extra dollars, that's who's really going to get excited about that.
For my part, I would say that the good news is over the last 4 years, legislative branch spending has gone from 3.2 to 3.8 billion. That's $600 million increase. Now, some of that's going to the architect of the Capitol and to other sorts of stuff that's not readily connected with staff capacity. But as I said in my remarks, $21 million more for CRS. That's an extraordinary development. And I think that it's absolutely true that anybody who stands up in Congress says, I want more money so I can have more staff on my personal office, is going to have a hard time making that case, because there is evidence that the public thinks individual members of Congress are overstaffed. But when it comes to like how many people are working at CBO, there's no connection in a member of the public's mind. I would say that most members of the public, quite frankly, A, don't know about CBO, and B, wouldn't even know if it was a legislative branch thing, and C, they're not going to see like some sort of nexus to corruption. I mean, with the personal staff, it's the image of like, oh yeah, you guys are paying people to drive you around in limousines and to wait on you hand and foot, and the famous senator who used to always have a hot dude service her bag guy. Like that sort of stuff, like, yeah, that ticks off voters, but the other stuff, I don't think it has a whole lot of salience. So I would hope that we'd have more members of Congress continue to invest in these kind of shared services.
I can just speak to GAO. Look, when we go into agencies and we find deficiencies, what's the first thing they tell us? We don't have enough money and resources, right? We don't make those recommendations to Congress. We go back to the agencies and say, no, you set the priorities on how you spend your money, and until you can demonstrate that you're spending what you have already as efficiently and effectively as you can, we're not going to make the case for you to get more additional resources. So if we're telling agencies that, we have to practice that ourselves within our own organization. And so GAO tries very hard to say, based on the resources Congress provides to us, how can we best use those? How can we align those resources to meet the needs of the Congress? How can we be more efficient? Can we cut our own costs and do everything possible before trying to make the case for additional resources? There are some downsides to that because we get more requests from the Congress than we can manage. And so we have, if we get requests from individual members of Congress, we usually don't have enough resources to get those requests because we give priority to chairs and ranking members. We also, because we have a backlog, sometimes that means it's going to take a while before we get to do the research to answer your question. So there are trade-offs there, but our mantra is be most efficient and effective as possible with the resources we have before we ask for more.
The agencies that we were talking about today are non-political agencies, but they are often asked to weigh in on political hot topics like climate change, the DHS and ICE family separation policy, the Affordable Health Care Act. How should those agencies weigh the politics of those issues in their analysis? And should they weigh those the political hot buttons while they're putting out resources that are supposed to be nonpartisan, fact-based? Kind of how do you guys see the role of these individuals and their kind of their judgment about that?
I think if they get dragged into the realm of making political recommendations, that's it. They're done for. So, in the history of the Congressional Budget Office, for example, the first director, Alice Rivlin, who's my former colleague at Brookings, she just made it very clear that this is an agency where we figure out how much things are going to cost. And then we tell you that, and you go figure out what to do with that information. And the agency developed a reputation for playing it straight, and so I think it has a good reputation on both sides of the aisle. I think it's been challenged in recent years because there's some very fraught questions about modeling assumptions. And some people think that CBO ought to be more transparent about exactly how it goes about doing certain analyses. And I'm sympathetic to some of those criticisms, actually. But I think the main thing is structurally these have to be support agencies. We help you figure out the facts about something, and then you have to go make the political choices.
Yeah, I think my only pushback there is I think now we're in an age where facts are becoming politicized. I think in 2017 there was this move by the Freedom Caucus to almost zero out CBO and I think it was largely in response to how they scored plans to roll back the Affordable Care Act. And so I don't know if the logic of relying on facts carries as much weight as it used to. Luckily, those efforts last year did not succeed. The plan there was to allow think tanks who already aggregate cost data to kind of carry on that role instead of CBO. We pushed back on it at Pogo. I'm really glad that it did not pass, but I also worry that we'll see a rise in this kind of move or this shift to, especially as we've discussed capacity issues and costs, to privatize some of these roles and to kind of look elsewhere. And I wonder if you guys have any thoughts about that.
My own sense is, I was at CRS. I and colleagues were certainly asked some pretty hot button questions, and to some degree, it was a matter of just through dialogue, working with the persons asking, to surface the fact that this is a pretty charged thing. We're in a lot of grief for this, but we're happy to help you, so that they were kind of at least aware that they were putting us in a difficult spot. And if they value us as a resource, well, be sweet to us. Come on. Laying out methodology for how you're going to do it up front. So if you're saying, well, if a question is this successful or a failure? Okay, you got to lay out the methodology. The criteria for success may be the following 5 things. These, however, are not the only criteria available. There are other criteria one may consider, and then you drop in a big footnote with a whole bunch of other criteria. So you put that sort of stuff up front, and honestly, another thing that agencies do to try to defang blowback is to write in something akin to Alan Greenspan speak, very passive language. On the one hand this, on the other hand this. Critics may argue, you put lots of citations on both sides of the sorts of things to show that you've kind of done your due diligence and you have taken a full range of views and perspectives and data sources and this, that, and the other. And it just, it makes for a more plodding read, which is a downside for the poor congressional staffer who requests these things. But on the other hand, you're getting the full enchilada. And, still you can go through all that. And if you just have somebody who just wants to yell and scream about something if they don't get the answer they want, it'll happen, and you take your lumps, and thankfully Congress is a majoritarian entity, so the ability to really lash back at a legislative branch support agency is it's not easily done.
And I loved the point you made earlier, Eileen, about when you're at GAO working with offices to craft what kind of questions to be asking. I think that's clearly, to me, it seems like a best practice that I would hope all the legislative support agencies are engaged in. I'd like to open up to the audience now for questions. We have a mic coming around. Abby, if we could start up here.
Hello. Hi, I'm Kevin Malshine, formerly of the Architect of the Capitol. And my question, there are two questions. One is, when you're talking about budgeting, it seems to me talking about Congress loses the fact that the Senate is relatively well-funded compared to the House. And so I think it's important to talk about how the House, over the last 20 years, 25 years, has been starving itself for staff. But and I missed my other question, but it seems to me, I know, what is immediately laying forward in this new Congress? I mean, I know that the House Administration Committee, which usually doesn't get organized very quickly, hears or sets the budget for committees. Is that do you anticipate that that's going to happen in this coming year? And if it doesn't happen until April or May, how are the committees funded? Is the funding as existed in the existing Congress, not in the future Congress? Do you know what next step steps are if, for example, the speaker, whoever she may be, says, I want to bulk up the staff on both sides of the House. What's the first opportunity that she will get to do that?
There's a lot there. To your first point, yes, the Senate and the House, there are absolute differences. Their numbers are comparable, but their membership isn't. And so Senate staffs are bigger, they have more people, but they represent wider constituencies, bigger offices, more district offices, so that's something to be, I don't know what the question was, but that is true, absolutely true. As far as the opportunity for appropriations, there's a lot of talk right now with disparate rules reforms and rules packages that staff have to be included. I'm assuming that this is part of the backdoor negotiations that are going on about who gets what support from whom. As far as opportunities to increase those, I know that there are every rules change that I've seen, or at least package of them, addresses this issue and makes it a big one. And these are usually bipartisan efforts, which is usually with money, increasing numbers through money. So Daniel, I know in the back will talk to your ear off about that, and he'll be correct, so I would listen to him.
My question is about the Congressional Regulation Office. So I work for the Small Business Committee, and we have somebody that does all the regulatory stuff, and she sent like 1,000 letters to every single person at every agency. I agree that there needs to be help with regulation. My only concern would be that in our experience with the SBA, the more we oversee and the more just more we pay attention to the regulations, the more they kind of go into the dark side and do more like standard operating procedures. And so now, like, they don't need, I think it's common in other agencies too, but there's a very obvious trend of going from the formal rulemaking process and the regulations to these SOPs, and oh, they're all online, but they're not, because I have one that isn't online about gifts to the agency. But, you know, how do you play that game without forcing them kind of to the back alleys? I mean that in a nice way.
Yeah. Back alley rulemaking.
I mean, I think it's a very serious question. I mean, I think
It is.
I think part of the answer is you have to have people capable of going into the back alleys, you know, who aren't going to get lost around three corners. You know, Congress needs to really, I think, sort of have a gut check on just how opaque a lot of the bureaucracy has become to it. You know, it just loses track of what's going on, and, you know, that can serve the interests of people who want things to stay the way they are. So to me, that just sounds like another argument for capacity, and a reason why capacity has to be built in sort of wily ways, instead of being overly formalistic.
I think it's really important to note that you said one person handles all regulation stuff, and it's she. It's a single person, all of them. That's crazy. There's a lot. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, something's happening. To point to a single person to handle all of that is just asking for a single person to hate their job.
Yeah, I would not want that job. I think we have one more question in the back.
Thanks, hi everyone. Daniel Schumann with Demand Progress. I have a GAO related question. So you had mentioned earlier about GAO's ability to engage oversight of the intelligence community, and I know that there's been problems where where the intelligence community has refused to recognize GAO's authority and says that it will often only give information to the intelligence committees. And I know there's been sort of legislative back and forth on this. I'm hoping that you could talk about that and provide a little bit more context about some of the reluctance. And since you had DOJ as part of your jurisdiction, maybe the OLC opinion that may have fit into that as well. Just to, and also just very briefly, like after that, maybe for the two of you guys, GAO also has responsibilities for looking at federal regulations, like it has under the CRA. So I'm just sort of curious how that fits in with the CRO. Sorry, I know it's two questions, not one, but I couldn't resist.
OMG.
Ready for that?
Sorry about the acronym soup.
I can try to address the first. I'm probably not the best person to address the second. One of the arguments that the intelligence community rightly makes is they have to be very careful about who they share information with because it can present vulnerabilities to their sources and methods. We have to battle a lot with how they define whether the information is a source and a method. And on a case-by-case basis, we've been slowly chipping away at those issues and developing working relationships with the intelligence communities. We've had success in the past with some of the military intelligence organizations. We've been able to do work in that area. We've been making some progress with CIA and some of those as well. And then I did a body of work where we sort of snuck into the back door of the intelligence arena through state and local organizations, state and local fusion centers, FBI, et cetera. So we're making progress, but there's a long history of not welcoming us into the community, and whether we have the statutory or legislative support to do that. And the FBI was. We also had to be very careful about the FBI because they live in both worlds, right? They live in intel and they live in law enforcement. And sometimes they wanted to deny us information claiming it was intel, but, so we had to fight that battle as well. I just wanted one more response to Liz's question earlier about how do we make sure that we stay independent. Look, we're independent and objective, but we don't want to be politically naive, do we? So one of the first things that we do when we get a question is our legislative research. Why did the Congress create this program? What do they think about this area? What are the politics of it? Because we have to make sure that we understand how our message is going to play out. And when we testify before Congress, we have to understand where each member's coming from on those issues, et cetera, so we can be prepared to be responsive. So we have a lot of safeguards in place to make sure that our work is independent, but we also have to be politically astute and understand the context of our work.
I think we have time for one more short question. Up here, up in the front.
I'm familiar with two GAO reports on single-payer systems during the 1990s, and I've been resurrecting them for some of my congressional representatives to use in the next session now that they have the majority. Do you remember working on any of those? They are both very positive, and they state that the system will pay for itself by eliminating the insurance industry, which skims billions off the top of money intended for health care.
Well, first of all, I'll pay you later for using our reports and resurrecting them. I was never really in that field in GAO. I was in defense, homeland security, some environmental issues, but I have colleagues that have done that work, so I can't speak to it. So sorry about that.
I do love telling people when I meet people from CRS or GAO that I've read their reports, and they're always very grateful to hear that.